Hello, hello, everyone. Let's get started. First, if you can hear my voice and see the REJI logo, go ahead and just find the chat box and just say yay or nay, just to make sure we're all good tech-wise. Awesome. Getting a whole bunch of yeses. Great, thank you. So I want to draw everyone's attention to, there is that chat box. And there is, you have the option to send chats directly to us or to all attendees, which is that little option right above the chat box. There's also a Q&A feature on Zoom here for questions that you have for any of us speaking today and our guest speakers, which I'll get into in a bit. Let me just check one thing on our side as folks are getting settled in. My name is Omid Bigari, Director of Equity and Community Partnership at Just Lead Washington.
Hi there.
And first off, happy birthday to the person next to me. It is Jen's birthday today. If you see them at any point, or if you just want to email them directly, definitely wish her happy birthday.
Feel free to send any gifts and acknowledgements. Even though birthdays are not as fun as they used to be, I still kind of love them.
All right, so if folks do have any other technical issues, go ahead and ping on the chat, and we'll make sure to respond, make sure folks can hear and see us. So just a little bit of the preview today. Today's webinar is focused on affinity groups or racial caucusing, as some folks might know it. We'll be using those interchangeably today, but primarily using the term affinity groups, in particular affinity groups by racial identity. So we're going to talk about what those are, why are they useful, and how they can be used as a strategy and tool to advance race equity organizationally, and talk about what that looks like for people of color, for white people. And throughout our whole webinar today, we're going to be getting into to-dos, not to-dos, and so forth. And I'm happy to say that we have two guest speakers with us today from our friends, colleagues, and REJI partners at Columbia Legal Services, Travis Andrews and Nick Straley, who will share a little bit of Columbia Legal Services perspective on doing affinity groups organizationally. So we will have time to kind of hear from them after Jen and I kind of kick us off here. All right, so again, we always start kind of big picture on what this work is and what we mean by race equity. So we want to just start with a few of these kind of contextual slides. So Just Lead Washington, Columbia Legal Services, and so many other folks across the state, a part of the Alliance, really focuses on goal one being race equity in the delivery of legal services and civil legal aid in particular, amongst other goals of legal education awareness and holistic client-centered services are all important goals. But we really want to center on goal one being race equity. This is not only a principle, a fundamental principle to do our work, but also kind of central to really advance equitable opportunities and access for not only civil legal aid services, but across the board when it comes to all of the determinants that really affect communities' overall health and well-being. And in particular, when we talk about race and racism, we're talking about communities of color. Part of that work is REJI, the Washington Race Equity and Justice Initiative, REJI for short. This work is driven by folks from across the state who have both acknowledged how racist our society is, how racist the law and justice system has been and continues to operate, but also makes the commitment to undo that racism in our work collectively and with each other, both in the law and justice system and collectively within ourselves. You know, we're going to talk a lot about affinity groups, which is very much operates on an interpersonal and individual and subconscious level, but also speaking to how it affects our work organizationally, how it affects our work with community, and how it ultimately affects our work societally when it comes to how our systems operate, systems of oppression that have been racialized. So all of that encompasses both the work of REJI, but also what we want to get in today, but in particular focusing on the strategy and tool of affinity groups. Is there anything that you would add, Jen? Awesome. That's me pausing. I start to talk and then I just keep talking. So I'm on my growing edge to pause when I can. Part of that work is the organizational race equity toolkit that we've developed. This really speaks to various dimensions that an organization can focus on in terms of focusing on and addressing race and racism organizationally. And those kind of fall into internal dimensions like securing an organizational commitment to race equity and creating a more equitable organizational culture, which we'll get into a little bit today, but also speaks to recruitment, hiring, and retaining you know, a workforce that is representative of the communities that we represent, and particularly of marginalized communities and people of color, and also developing accountability to and partnerships with communities of color, and ultimately applying an anti-racist lens to our work. That toolkit you can access and view on the REJI website, but also on the address you see on the screen in front of you that really dives into what we're going to talk about today, but a whole range of other topics that comes up when you talk about race equity on an organizational level. Racial equity. We always start with this definition to be really clear about what we mean, but also so we can all be operating from a shared understanding. When we talk about racial equity, we're talking about a point where race no longer determines one's outcomes. To maintain that racial equity also requires proactive reinforcement of policies, practices, attitudes, and actions that produce equitable power, access, opportunities, and ultimately an equitable impact from our organizations, from the systems that both we interact with, but also the systems that we are a part of. Many folks on this on the webinar, from what we've seen, it's certainly part of the law and justice system, but we think about all the systems that we're a part of and think about the impact that we're all collectively creating together in the work we do, and really focusing on being impact conscious and how that both advances race equity, but also how it can undermine race equity. Nice. So, you know, we talked a little bit about our work today is going to focus a little bit on those interpersonal, individual, subconscious levels inherently, because affinity group work, as we get into, it very much, you know, requires each of us to, you know, operate in brave spaces and be centered in our own lived experience. But we're going to talk about that a little bit on an organizational level and how that can advance race equity. And, you know, the REJI and the toolkit really focuses on all of these levels. We would say all 5 levels that you see before you are levels of race equity work that are both important. They're all interconnected and in many ways can be dependent on each other. So, you know, we'll be focusing largely on maybe the lower levels here or the middle level here when it comes to organizational, institutional, but just something to keep in mind on the context of this race equity work, that it operates on all these levels, and in the work that we do, we should be looking and prioritizing work across all these levels. So I really want to, with folks who are on the webinar, really hear from folks about what brought them into this webinar today. What about affinity groups or caucusing sparks your interest, and what brought you in to this webinar, just for us to get a feel for where folks are at, and so kind of shape a little bit what we'll say and what our guest speakers, Travis and Nick, will speak to as well. So if folks can, as you're thinking about it, jump on the chat and share a few chat responses on your thoughts to this question. What about affinity groups or caucusing sparks your interest for today? We'll just take a moment for those to come through.
We'd also love to hear from you through the chat pod about whether you've had any experience with affinity groups or caucuses, particularly if you've done this based on racial identity. So let us know, is this a new concept to you? Is this something that you're familiar with and have participated in? Love to hear that context too.
Awesome. So just reading some of the responses that are coming in. I'm seeing folks that don't have any experience, but are interested in the topic generally. They have gotten maybe requests from folks at their organizations, from people of color and white folks, about having a caucus affinity space.
Like seeing how folks are talking about how to make the case for doing this at your organization, what some of the pitfalls are, and we'll happily share many pitfalls that we've experienced ourselves for sure. So yeah, this is exciting. It sounds like you guys, we're in the right place today.
Awesome. Thank you for all these responses. And I'm seeing responses too about what this work looks like for white people as well. And so we'll be able to get into all this stuff, but I really appreciate folks sharing kind of these initial thoughts.
At the end, we're seeing some questions and invitation for organizations to talk to each other. And we have seen, certainly in the REJI meetings that we've hosted, that there is a lot to be gained by organizations talking directly with each other about practices that they've started at their organization. These are the types of strategies that have been around for a long time, and so really encourage, and we'll at the end and in our follow-up talk about ways in which to invite you to keep the conversation going with each other, to kind of spark that collective learning.
Awesome. So let's dive into it. What is an affinity group? When we talk about affinity groups, we are talking about a really organized space to allow folks based on their racial identity, whether you're a person of color, you identify as white, you identify as multiracial, to collectively explore what anti-racism work, what anti-racism looks like in your life, in your work, and organizationally. The focus of that, of these spaces can vary, but what we'll say a few times today is that this work is in the name of anti-racism. It is to explore what that looks like in our lives. So, when it comes to affinity groups, that term in itself, there can be affinity groups across many different identities and beyond race as well. Today, we are focusing specifically on affinity groups based on racial identity. And ideally, there would be as many affinity groups as there are racial identities in a space. And there is value in finding the collective experience, the shared experiences amongst people of color, for example, to really understand where those kind of relatable shared experiences lie, but also as an opportunity to explore differences. Each of us have a unique relationship with race and racism, and these spaces are ways for folks to investigate that work for themselves, but also with each other, kind of in a shared experience. And this applies to white folks as well, who maybe are usually used to being collectivized, maybe historically collectivized in a negative light, in a racist way. But again, when we talk about affinity groups, we're talking about racial caucusing, we're talking about doing it in the name of anti-racism and exploring what that looks like based on racial identity in a U.S. context, which we know, terms like people of color and white and so forth have been racialized in ways that have been oppressive. So again, this is to contrast that. Is there anything you would add, Tim?
That's excited to talk about kind of making the case for it and why to do this, because it is and we just also acknowledge that it can be a strange and for many folks uncomfortable concept to think about intentionally dividing by race, and we just offer that, just to add, you were also saying this as well, like this happens naturally, that segregation, unfortunately, in our daily life. And, from speaking as a white person, right, it's pretty common to be in spaces that are entirely populated by other white folks. But what's unique about this is that intentionality, in that we're building spaces for the very purpose of working towards anti-racism. So echoing.
Awesome. Just flagging one request, just to be, if folks do want to share their thoughts on chat with all attendees, go ahead and do so. Folks that have shared thus far have only shared it with us directly.
I just had to change the setting for that, so now folks can
okay.
do both. Yeah.
Got you. Great. So everyone should be able to see things, see both responses that come in. All right. So, what we'll kind of hone in on today, and we've touched on one of these already, is, racial affinity groups really focus on building relationships, is really focused on building community with each other, and all, again, in the name of anti-racism. These three things, affinity groups in practice touch on one or all of these things. One being in the name of anti-racism, but really the central piece is being able to build that community, being able to center ourselves and our lived experience to really understand what has been the impact of living in a racist society, which is, racism is inherently dehumanizing. So really being able to explore that together and build relationships and build connection and trust with each other to really build up our consciousness to be able to do and operate in a more anti-racist way. Again, for our personal selves, but also in the ways that it extends into our work. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit. So talking about why CAUCUS, why be a part of affinity group for people of color. This is not a exhaustive list, but really when we are focusing on affinity groups, or the value of them, it really come down to what it looks like to create a kind of a quote unquote protected, brave space for people of color to talking about and address experience of racism, and really undo our internalized oppression as well. This piece is really key to really understand how racism has been dehumanizing, and how there are messages about our racial identities that we see in the media as one example, one source of ways we can internalize subconsciously, right, messages about who we are by seeing negative images and representation of people that look like us and of our own cultures. Creating that space, people of color affinity space, is a retreat from quote unquote the continuous white gaze, right? So we, by working in the places we work and living in the country that we live in, are often, if not always, in predominantly white spaces that kind of perpetuate unintentionally and intentionally a dominant way of thinking, which we're going to get into a little bit when we talk about dominant culture and dominant white culture. So, you know, a POC-centered space is one way to retreat from that continuous white gaze. It is focused on building relationships and support so we can, you know, build up our own self-determination, really do the work that we want to do and build up and center our own agency to really be in our own power to navigate life and the spaces that we work and live within. Part of that ultimately comes down to that counter space for folks of color, and to build up our own collective power to become a body politic, which we're going to get to and unpack a little bit in an organizational context. You know, the idea of a POC, people of color affinity space, in itself isn't necessarily a new idea. Even the terms affinity groups, they have maybe are relatively new, but the concept of it has been around for generations. I would argue that we are here because, and when I say we, I mean in this case folks of color, we are here because our ancestors by their nature found spaces for themselves and for their own livelihood. And today we see a lot of, you know, legislative caucuses that are based on ethnicity and racial identity. We see student associations that are based on racial ethnicity, minority bar associations. All of these conceptually are related to the same idea behind people of color affinity spaces. But again, you know, putting this term on it and with the focus of anti-racism and race equity within our organizations, affinity groups kind of add on a more intentional process and space to really focus on race equity. Got you. We got a question that came directly to us. Where is the question?
It's not a question, it's just value of
Got you. So just bringing in a comment based on in reference to the people of color affinity space, and that it allows people of color to deal with their own awakening about how racism has impacted our lives, and to ask questions of one another, and to put words to the feelings that have surrounded them all their lives. You know, in our experience, for folks who are just diving in to a space like that, it can feel, we have heard, and I have experienced myself when I first did affinity spaces, that that awakening that SB Borboa, who shared over at ELAP, another REJI partner, friend, and colleague, that experience of awakening, I think, is really key. And that's really where our consciousness can get built. Really, we can understand how to be more in our own power. That's a really great add there.
So I'll just speak a little bit to the value and the why of why white folks should get together and talk intentionally about race. And again, this is very much about gathering for the purpose of coming together and figuring out where we can collectivize the power and privilege that we do have, and hear what our colleagues of color need and are asking for, and figure out how to be the allies, the accomplices, the co-conspirator to the anti-racism work. And so for white folks, you know, CAUCUS really gives us some intentional space to kind of understand and unpack and analyze our whiteness. And that means understanding what dominant culture, what workplace culture, and our societal culture that has largely been built and supported and supports folks who like me, and what that means. Really think critically about the ways in which we personally and within our institutions and communities and systems have benefited from systems and decisions that privilege folks with white skin or who are socialized as white, and to really think about the ways that we might, whether it's intentional or unintentional, be creating or perpetuating the harm to communities of color and our colleagues of color. color. So being in a white space means that the responsibility is on us to kind of hold each other accountable to our work. You know, I've been in caucuses where folks have really directly said, you know, here's what my stated values are. When you see me operating in some way that conflicts with that, please call me in and invite, tell me what I'm doing, and let's have a conversation about that. And this can be very different from what the default often is for us as white folks, is we want to rely on the emotional labor and time and experience of our colleagues and friends of colors to educate us and tell us what we need to do and what's just give me the checklist. And really these spaces are about us learning from each other, teaching one another, and not relying on people of color to teach us. It's also a space where we can work through really complicated emotions like shame, like grief, like guilt, which are real experiences and feelings that white folks are working through as we come to our own racist past and history, and try to understand what that allyship and work looks like towards anti-racism. But we can do these ways in a way that's sort of contained and prevents us from creating additional harm, or at least not burdening our colleagues and friends of color. If you have white lady tears to shed, this is the space. This is the space to do it. If you just realize that you made problematic comments and want to work through how to respond to that, you can do that in this space. And I would just say for me, actually what a really powerful experience recently has been in a caucus that just started, and when I've been finding spaces to work with other white women on anti-racism work, that's been a space to work through kind of the combination of the ways in which like, for example, I've internalized sexism and oppression based on other identities, but really working through that and to understand how those experiences and feelings are standing in the way of being, of effectively engaging in anti-racist work. For white folks, caucusing is also about this relationship building. It's about accountability, and it's also where we need to figure out how to collectivize the power that we do have in support of the shared anti-racism goals and work.
So we got one question just to surface, and the question is, would it be that affinity spaces for white people are about dealing with our internalized domination, this being a juxtaposition to what folks of color are exploring in their internalized oppression?
Yeah, and actually raises a good question. Maybe we can pause on for a little bit to talk about like what are the things that come up in these spaces, because they can be different. And yes, absolutely, we should be talking about internalized white supremacy and white supremacy culture in white caucuses for sure. That's definitely a common topic. I'd say some of the, I think I mentioned before, some of the other things, it's kind of working through and how to become more productive around feelings of guilt and shame, and how we've benefited from a past that we've both contributed to and has happened with, unintentionally without us personally, but it is the racialized systems that we operate in. Also, we talk about just figuring out how this manifests in the workplace. Most of the caucusing that we're talking about is taking place in work, and so we need to keep intentionally kind of driving back to how we create and uphold things like white supremacy and white dominant culture within our workspaces, where we do things like what we call gatekeep and withhold, like kind of not live out our values in decision making and sharing power, and then just honestly getting to the point where we're talking about things like what our colleague Ada is slipping us a note here, the 3 Ds: denial, deflection, and defensiveness. That's where things like dealing with white fragility and kind of figure out how we are putting up barriers. Why is it so hard to receive feedback or have someone note that a comment you may have made is racist, and what I love that denial, deflection, and defensiveness, the 3 Ds that come up for white folks. about in POC spaces?
Yeah. I mean, when I think of that question too, you know, when I think about racism being inherently dehumanizing, certainly folks of color were the most acutely harmed by racism. But also thinking about how both people of color and white people are dehumanized. What did white people have to give up to be able to benefit from the structures of racism in the US? And that being turned into an internalized racial superiority and that internalized white supremacy. You know, that being the dehumanization aspect of it all. Folks of color, you know, are those acute instances, whether it be, you know, explicit acts of racism, or the implicit microaggressions that come up in our day-to-day lives. You know, those are certainly topics that come up. Folks of color, we're talking about colorism within our own communities. We're talking about anti-Blackness and anti-Indigenous Native invisibilization. We're talking about kind of how we might push ourselves away from our own communities or other people that look like us. You know, one personal example was when the Muslim ban was first enacted. I know members of my own community, the Iranian community, I heard them saying, oh, Saudi Arabia or other countries that they named should be on the Muslim ban. Why is Iran on the Muslim ban? And my response always in those situations, I don't know if the answer to racism is more racism. We need to be clear on, you know, how these larger systems operate, how white domination and white supremacy pits communities of color against each other, how things like the model minority myth that often gets applied to folks of Asian descent have been used to, again, pit folks against each other, and how it was used in the civil rights era to, you know, model, quote unquote, model minority behavior and, you know, not rocking the boat. All these different ways where we don't allow our true voice and power to sometimes not come out, and then also talking about ways how our true voice and power is oppressed and rejected by white dominated spaces, and how, you know, racist kind of dynamics end up playing out in our lives. Tokenism is definitely a big one as well, in the ways that we often see white dominated organizations kind of put one person color up as a symbol of diversity or inclusion or of anti-racism, but not really either organizationally or moving forward in any meaningful race equity goals, but also not really giving even that one tokenized person any true power to advance change or to oppress their work in ways that don't really allow for their unique and important valued lived experience to be centered and highlighted. And of course, being tokenized often ends up being one or two people being tokenized. If there's one or two people of color in an organization that is talking a lot of talk, but their staff or their volunteers or their boards or what have you are not representative of the communities they're serving, they don't have the lived experiences represented to really guide the decision making and shaping the design of our work. All of these can lead to that tokenization that folks who are, you know, navigating systems, these white racist systems, and maybe are being successful in their navigating systems, but also might be being tokenized along the way. But being able to awaken an understanding of what that looks like, and empower ourselves to navigate those spaces in ways that can really be anti-racist and push back against that kind of those tokenized dynamics that happen, but other kind of racist dynamics that happen as well. So overcoming resistance. There are a lot of common things that we have heard when talking about affinity groups, introducing it, when folks are first coming into really understanding what that is and what it looks like. We're just going to touch on a few of them and just kind of speak on a few of the typical things we've heard. So, you know, some of these are, you know, I don't belong here. If the point is unity, why divide us? And I think Jen mentioned a little bit earlier is we're already divided. We already live, because of racist history and policies and systems, in segregated neighborhoods, segregated school districts, and all these different ways that we have been, the status quo based on that racist history has divided us. So again, affinity groups is intentionally creating spaces for us to do that separate work in the name of anti-racism, both separately and together. So, you know, but that feeling is unnatural for folks who have been conditioned to think that our society as it is equitable, is fair, does allow, you know, or does support, you know, the myth of meritocracy, that if you work hard, that anyone can access anything. But again, how our systems operate, we see huge advantages and disadvantages based on race. And so affinity groups are a way of shining a light onto that, and actually us getting uncomfortable to be more comfortable with the reality of how our organizations and society operates in racist ways.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, you know, having only operated with white affinity spaces, pretty much everyone I've ever been in has, you know, the overwhelming feeling is discomfort, if not there being some active resistance for folks who, you know, aren't going to set foot in the door, or who, you know, may sit there with their arms crossed because of how weird it feels and unpleasant it feels. You know, a lot of that is because white folks we're not used to being racialized. When we talked about race historically, we're talking, it's an extension of creating a way of othering other groups, instead of creating that kind of circle of human concern and feeling of belongingness that we're working towards, saying, you know, if we're talking about race, we're talking about what's happening to communities of color. That is very true, but a part of that dialogue and our work, particularly as white folks, is seeing ourselves as racialized as white, and what that means. And it also means, I mean, we're getting to know, if we're sitting in the spaces, it means we're in the middle of doing some really hard work to undo centuries of racism. And it's, you know, some folks would describe it like kind of like the Matrix, right? And you take the red pill and it's like you walked into this world of pain. Like once you see it, and you, as you're becoming more and more aware of how, you know, we're all operating in this racialized society, you can't really turn that off. And it's hard work, and it's uncomfortable to be in that space, but the value of reclaiming our humanity and is really priceless. So.
And these are just a few of the things that we've heard in our work so far, including, can't we just go get coffee?
Yeah.
And you know, this middle comment too, I'll just mention, you know, it will create more problems than it will fix. For me, my next question is, what problems already exist that we're not addressing? And you know, again, there's a discomfort of this quote unquote separation that people feel when it comes to conducting affinity groups. But again, we're shining a light onto what is already there, and really moving towards a very important exploration of a topic that often doesn't get discussed in our workplaces, which is focusing on how race and racism impact our lives, and strategies and ways to be more anti-racist.
I think all I would add here is that, yeah, so some of this resistance, there's an article that we can share out that at least I personally found kind of meaningful, talking about some of the resistance is fear, right? On one side, you know, thinking about the, you know, do we want to let white folks go off and organize? There's plenty of reasons to be concerned about that, but you know, some of it is, you know, folks who might worry because of that historical context, that they're like to be mistrustful of creating these separate spaces, which we'll talk a little bit about as we're building effective structures for this, the importance of accountability, particularly white folks, and being really transparent and accountable to colleagues of color. But also, you know, I think that white people, we need to acknowledge that some of that fear is like, well, what's going to happen if, you know, all of our colleagues of color go and organize, and that fear of like actually of the collective power that can come from that space. If you are holding power, does that mean you have to give it up as if it is a finite resource? And so sometimes it can be helpful with this feelings that are coming up as we're doing this hard work to kind of surface and name some of these dynamics that can stand in the way of having really meaningful dialogue. And yeah, and I'll also just finally add that, you know, don't just go and get coffee, you know, as white colleagues operating in a workplace. You know, one of our highest and best uses as an ally is to support and encourage. If our colleagues of color are asking for space, we should use our voices and power to support moving that forward, but that is not enough. We have plenty of work to do, and you know, we've heard various versions of that sort of like, well isn't enough, can't we, you know, just let that be? And to which at one point I think I said, you know, if we went and I asked, so Amita, if I said, hey, I'm glad you guys are having an affinity space, you know, that's great, but you're cool if I just duck out and early, right? Because my work here is done. Like I don't think that's a conversation that would go that well.
No, not at all. And one of my ongoing PSAs, when you talk about, and specifically when it comes to workplace culture and an equitable workplace culture, and even the retention of folks of color in a workplace, one of my PSAs is work on the white people, because oftentimes folks of color do not stay in a place because it is inequitable or it is perpetuating those racial dynamics, and folks of color don't want to stay, and they shouldn't. But you know, that PSA comes back to, okay, well, a white affinity space is a place where white folks can do their own work, to educate themselves, and to explore what anti-racism and accountability looks like, what it means to be an accomplice, to really feel personally connected to this work. So yeah, that response, or can we go just get coffee? For me, that is not really taking responsibility for what the work looks like, and again, letting the burden fall on folks of color to wholly hold that work and move it along. That's good. So just a few suggested practices for starting affinity groups. We're just gonna kind of move through these. A lot of them are straightforward, but one of them is just having a goal in mind, and having a goal and having a vision. You know, in an organizational context, affinity groups is a strategy to advance race equity. It can and should be a way to shape kind of internal culture and policy. That could be a goal, but first and foremost, it could have that goal of building relationships and community to really understand how these things are playing out in our work. Those are just examples of goals. They tend to be the common ones, and ones that we feel are important to kind of ground it in a way that kind of centers our own individual selves, but also can lead to the more organizational work as well.
Yeah, ideally this broader commitment to taking on that equity work within your organization. It may be the starting point for it, but hopefully it's not an isolated attempt at doing that work. It can be a nice complement to organizational priorities that are identified and work that might be happening, so that you can kind of bring back the work on an ongoing basis into spaces, and to kind of debrief it and figure out next steps. And you know, yeah, always connecting this to the value, you know, or this whole community of folks we do this work with are mission-driven, social justice minded. So connecting that work to meeting your organizational goals would be really valuable. Yeah, generating that buy-in. And this kind of goes to also this expecting and preparing for resistance at the bottom here. You want to be able to get out in front of, you know, we know that this is a new concept, an uncomfortable concept for many. So get out in front of it, evangelize it, explain it, share resources, and start with some conversations, whether it's training or just real dialogue. And to the extent that you can start from a sort of shared starting point, just like we did at the beginning of this webinar, right? We're providing some framework, some language that everyone can use, that even if we do kind of divide to do some of our work, we're kind of starting with the same shared goals and vocabulary and understandings to ground that work.
Oftentimes, affinity spaces feel shorter in logistically, because there's so much to talk about, because the topics are so big. So just, you know, thinking about investing enough time for those big conversations to happen and for them to be consistent and reoccurring in ways that allow those deep conversations to occur. You know, we had one question about the facilitation support. So, you know, it is generally a good idea to have a facilitator, and that could be someone internally, but oftentimes organizations might opt to have an external facilitator, just again to facilitate a conversation and facilitate a potentially personal and difficult conversation. You know, the facilitation support could be minimal, but it is still important to have someone kind of being focused on ensuring that the goals of the group, you know, either official or unofficial structured agenda is focused on, just to ensure that a space can be created that all folks feel comfortable participating in.
Yeah, I would just say I'm personally a big advocate of at least starting with some intentional and potentially external facilitation. This is hard work. These are hard conversations, and to the extent that, you know, you're doing this internally in your organization, you want to be able to participate in the conversation as well. But, you know, can be informed by what your real goals are. If you want to build a bench of folks who get really comfortable with the hard facilitation work, then use that. But definitely. I also just want to mention something on the logistics point, because you can learn from a couple of mistakes. I would say almost never have enough time. So however amount of time you think you're going to spend, assume that things are going to run longer. These are really big conversations to have on both sides. And we've often, again, from the White Caucus perspective, we've often, when we don't devote enough time, we don't get to the real, like, deeper emotional and relational work, because white folks tend to start in the headspace and intellectualize all of this, and it does take a lot of trust and relationship building to get to the good stuff. And even things like logistics and where you're meeting, you know, big lesson learned. This sounds small, but it's not. You know, we're usually starting in mixed spaces that are dominated by white folks, and there's not always a equal number of people of color participating in mixed spaces, and so the tendency is to kind of send out the folks of color, be like, oh, go find a little room to work in, and sending our colleagues of color out, which does not exactly model this work that should be centered on the priorities and needs of our colleagues of color. So just an example of a logistical item to think about.
And we talked a little about resistance. So, you know, by starting an affinity group, you will likely not get everyone in that space the first time or the second time, but it is a responsibility, I feel, if it is a shared goal, concerted effort, to recruit folks into that space. So for white folks, holding white folks accountable to bring other white folks into that space, for them to do that work. And for folks of color to bring in other folks of color into the space to really, again, build that community, build those relationships, and ultimately work towards kind of bringing in all the varied perspectives that folks of color can bring from different cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Yeah, I think
we have a question about explaining more about facilitation, what the role of a facilitator would be, and kind of the structure and logistics around it. And that can really depend, again, on your goals, but what that person's role is, whether it's someone internally or externally, is to basically, create and hold space for the process. In white spaces, often there's sort of, there's a big educational component, sort of curriculum driven, like we want to have our, checklist of things to talk about in our curriculum, and there's often like a sort of resource and curriculum development component that comes on to figure out, at least where to start conversation, and then to hold space, things that come up like in any meeting, who is, taking up all the air and energy, and how do you bring it back to shared themes. So facilitators are playing a really active role in ensuring that the space is relevant and productive for everyone there. And the ways in which you do that look very different depending on your style, but it's someone who's kind of keeping an eye on the dynamics that are coming up in the room and threading things together and being that sort of connective tissue.
Definitely, and I think that connects to a few of these last suggested practices that we touched on a little bit, but just having ground rules that everyone can shape and develop together, so folks can feel like they can participate and be brave in these spaces. That ongoing commitment, doing it more and more, is a part of changing in culture to kind of center the topic of race and racism, and can be a way to create space to have these conversations, which can inherently have an effect on the other conversations and topics that are had in other meetings internally. And ultimately, what we'll speak to and what you'll hear from Travis and Nick from CLS is, being flexible in your approach. These are what we've learned to be constants of things we're sharing across different organizations and work we've done. But there is a flexibility that is needed as well to really take the time, invest the time to have conversations with your colleagues, to be able to create a space that makes sense for your workplace. And part of that is being flexible in your approach.
Yeah, and things will definitely come up depending on your organization too, the size of your organization, the complexity of it. Do you do something that's just for your field office? Do you do it for the organization as a whole? What spaces, how many spaces you might create, whether you want to include management and leadership in all the conversations, or if there's some kind of frontline staff opportunities. There are a lot of considerations that you want to kind of think about up front and be intentional about. Do you see a question about whether we have some ground rules to share to use as a starting point? And we do, and we can include that in the follow-up email along with the slides and some other resources as well.
Definitely, yeah. It is included in our toolkit, and we'll send all that out. For another question is, can you say more about how an organization gets the white people in the organization to create and sustain an affinity group on race equity? For folks of color, it seems easier. I think this is a question probably all of us could chat on, and maybe Travis and Nick might have some thoughts on as well in a moment when we switch over to them. But for me, I think really it's doing that initial that buy-in work, that shared goal and commitment work, for white folks to feel personally connected to this work. Not doing it because some external factor, but for them to really understand that their individual impact that they're having on their colleagues is harmful. And I'm saying that as a generalized statement because that is what we see as far as patterns when we talk about how our internalized racism or implicit racial biases that white folks hold might have a negative impact on people of color. So really to feel that personal attachment and that it conflicts with their own personal values. I think that personal hook for me, being able to invest the time with the relationships that exist and that can be built up, is, I think, an important strategy to build up the long-term goal in personal work that is necessary to kind of maintain and sustain things.
Yeah, I think I would add, so there needs to be some champions for the ongoing work for sure, folks who do have that kind of real understanding and are personally committed. And, you know, likely if you are super personally committed to your ongoing work and development, you're going to want a space like this. I know I certainly felt like I need, like I'm doing my own work, but that I need to find my peers that I can do this work in. So identifying who those folks are who are going to kind of keep the flame lit, but that, and also just acknowledging that that's not enough. If the commitment to equity work within your organization is held just with one person or a handful of people and they leave, then the work stops with them, and we hear this constantly between our partners. Like, well, we had a designated person or we had a committee, but then, you know, there was transition, and so that's just all the more reason to figure out the ways that you can build in the commitment to your resources and structure. Right? Where is this? And that does, you know, usually require leadership commitment to the work. The decision makers need to be investing time and resources.
So just kind of wrapping up, we're talking about racial affinity groups in the name of anti-racism. So that is to build relationships, it is to build community, and to become a body politic organizationally, which oftentimes can be part of the initial goal, but oftentimes becomes an important goal, because once that space is created and that consciousness continues to get built, naturally there are strategies and requests and demands that come of how to create a more equitable workspace that is more anti-racist and aligned, oftentimes with, you know, the mission and vision of our organizations and all the things we're working for when we do justice work. You know, those relationships can really fuel connection and support, to understand our lived experiences, and to build trust with another, to continue this work together. You know, building community really creates that belongingness that racism really undermines in our work and in society, but also allows for healing as well. And we can kind of share and with each other and relate on our shared experiences. And that becoming a body politic ultimately is about creating that collective power. And, you know, where folks of color can shape and guide what the work ahead looks like, white folks can be allies and accomplices to what that shaped work by folks of color is. So then together that collective power can be built that is really in sync with not only the race equity work, but what is being discussed in the people of color affinity space, and their experiences on how to change things. Folks, again, one of the main principles we often tout in race equity work is that folks who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution. So if we can acknowledge that racism is most acutely affecting folks of color, then the lived experiences of that impact is really where we can start to understand what needs to change to make it more equitable and anti-racist.
I love this image because it's kind of almost dizzying and overwhelming and messy, which I think completely encapsulates. Wait, if it made me also want to eat a lot of candy and chocolate, it would totally encapsulate my feelings about doing anti-racism work. But yeah, no, I love it. I just really like how interwoven all of these things are, and just reinforcing the idea that this is ongoing work.
And, you know, one thing we've already touched on is you know, that work is most effective when it's happening in concert with each other. So when the work that folks of color and white folks are doing are working in parallel, and really what binds things together is the accountability piece, is the communication. You know, that the work is guided by the leadership of the folks of color, but also that there is a transparent white space where that work can kind of be those check-ins can happen, so there can be kind of an openness to what is being discussed, and understanding of how to keep the work moving forward in a meaningful way for white folks. If another visual here is where these arrows would cross, because it is important to come together, and that's really where the accountability and communication piece comes in. But that work needs to be in sync. You're going to add something, Jen?
Yeah, I would add another lesson learned and sort of point of emphasis of around this accountability. Even the way in which accountability happens should be led by our colleagues and friends of color. A practice we often use is that folks of color, we come back into a shared space, so they're invited to, but do not need to share what's happening in this space. But the default is typically that we want to encourage the white folks to at least share out some themes, or if invited to share, to provide some way of sharing information about what's happening in the white space. But whether that happens and how that happens should be determined by folks of color. And also, just this is the one of many lessons learned. If white folks are sharing out what is happening, do that in a balanced way that is not, another burden for our colleagues of color to have to, listen to our confessions of all of the ways in which we realize we've been racist, or that is presented in a way that doesn't, go back to centering the white folks' experience and our, journey towards being woke or what have you. So, make it action oriented, be responsible for what your colleagues are asking for and needing, and leave it there. Is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. And, just as another sample, a lot of this work is about organizational change when it happens within organizations. So, this is in our REJI Toolkit. There are a lot of versions of this, but really just focusing on that it's an ongoing process, it's a circular process, and that change and the exploration of anti-racism in affinity spaces is really to move towards a more equitable workplace culture. For the sake of time, we're just going to move forward and bring in Travis and Nick here, but just plugging again that white culture is often a topic that comes up, and really understanding ways this is showing up in our own organizations and ways that it is creating an inequitable workplace culture. So again, you can find, we'll send out resources on this, but these are just, buckets of topics that tend to come out.
And if you want to dive deep into the Thinking About Culture, our last webinar that's posted on the REJI website that we'll share out, went deeply into this piece.
All right, so without further ado, we have, again, our friends, colleagues, and REJI partners, Travis Andrews and Nick Straley from Columbia Legal Services. I will allow them to, introduce themselves and share more. Travis and Nick, give me a second while I make sure all your video and audio is ready to go, and then y'all can take it away. Hello, and it looks like y'all can share your video. It doesn't seem, if you want, it doesn't seem like I have that feature on my end.
It says, mine says you can't start your video because the host has stopped it.
Ha! Classic.
Are you both in the same place?
No, they're in separate places.
Yeah, mine says the same thing.
Get it started, we'll play with the video aspect.
Okay. I'm sorry, I can't hear you, Nick.
Did you want to go first?
Yeah, I'll just give kind of an overview and broad history of how we got to the caucusing space, and then kind of go from there. So Columbia Legal Services, we had an equity training here at our organization, and I believe it was 2015. And through that equity conversation, the equity training, we realized that we had some work to do in terms of our internal race equity work. And so from that meeting, the collective was kind of born, and then from there they began to meet and identified several areas within our organization that could really use some attention in terms of race equity. And from that was our collective letter was kind of born out of that. So there were certain things that were identified, including our hiring practices, ways to retain, people of color, things such as mentoring programs and things like that. That collective letter went out to the entire organization, and from that, kind of our internal race equity work was born, and as well as our affinity groups. So the way our affinity group is structured here is we have a white allies group, which Nick will talk about, and then we have the collective. The collective is constructed of every person of color has an opportunity to engage in this group. It is not a requirement, but it is highly recommended. And so anyone who identifies as a person of color is open to participating in that group. We typically have 2 people who are facilitators on a quarterly basis. What that looks like is the facilitators will create the meeting agenda, they facilitate the meetings, and they are the people who do all of the communicating for that period of time. We meet on a monthly basis, so once per month we gather either in person or via Zoom, and we discuss random things, anything from, internalized depression, or, how to survive a police encounter, or I think my video is working here now. Okay, there we go. How to survive a police encounter, how to, navigate a situation where you can show up at work and still be authentic within yourselves. So those are some of the topics that we have addressed throughout our, my time with the collective. But also with that, we work on actual projects. So as we continue to, move our organization more and more in line with racial equity, there are certain things that we continue to work on. So currently, our collective is working on our vendor vetting process. So we want to make sure that at Columbia Legal Services, the folks who we hire as vendors are just as equitable and conscious as we are as an organization, or at least making those efforts. And so currently, the collective is working on that vendor vetting process. And what we find is, when you have a project to work on, it keeps folks engaged, and it keeps people really, wanting to come and be a part of that process. We are a legal aid organization, meaning folks have, legal mindsets. And so it's that has been beneficial in terms of keeping folks connected throughout my time with the collective. So the purpose of this has been to both create and provide space. I think someone said this earlier in one of the chats, create a space where folks can talk about and be honest and transparent around things that they experience, either at work or in their personal lives, or just in the world in general. And that's just, I'm not sure if folks know, but like showing up as a person of color in a predominantly white space, oftentimes things happen that you're not sure if, am I, interpreting this the right way? Is this something that I'm actually experiencing? People of color, the folks in our collective ask themselves these questions. And that was one of the things that came up once we started meeting, is people have been asking themselves these questions and haven't had anyone to kind of bounce some of these concepts off of. And so that's a part of what we do. The other part that we do is we provide guidance and hold our organization accountable from the inside. So whether that's weighing in on our community engagement process, or weighing in on a particular piece of advocacy, those are things that our collective works on as well. So one of the things that we've been working on most recently is how to connect the collective with the white allies and create some sort of engagement between the two of those groups. That's something that we're currently working on now, but what we find is that when you can create a project for folks to work on, it creates space and it creates opportunity for people to come together. And then we can start to build in some of those more specific race, equity, racial conversations as we move forward. So I'll kind of end there and let Nick kind of go into you know, his take on the white allies. But I do want to provide space for the successes and pitfalls. But I wanted to make sure that Nick had an opportunity to kind of explain what the White Allies group here is doing.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. Just as a way of background, I just sort of wanted to explain how I came into this entire effort. So if there was a checklist of privilege, I would be ticking every single box. And one of the privileges I have is that I work at an organization that has leaders and a legacy of leadership that has really put issues of racial equity central. So folks like Travis, Michelle Majors, Murph Eamon, Teresa Kearns, Janet Chung have all recently pushed us in the right direction. But then in the past, we've also had leaders like Aurora Martin and Ada who have tried to center issues of racial equity here at CLS and have really championed all of us working on these issues collectively and individually. And I think that's a really important point, is that I have the privilege of working at an organization that has leaders who have prioritized this issue and made it something that they expect us to participate in and really grapple with. In terms of the White Allies group, I think a lot of the points that Omid and Jen made applied to us and continue to apply to us. Travis sort of gave you a background of where these affinity groups came from, and that's accurate. But it wasn't a seamless process, particularly for the White Allies group. Initially, we started with two affinity groups. We started with one affinity group that was made up primarily of white men, and another affinity group that was made up of primarily white women. And you may not all be surprised to hear that the group made up of white women was actually relatively effective at setting agendas, meeting, and moving forward in a really helpful, I think, for them way. The group that was made up primarily of white men was much more navel-gazing, spinning our wheels, uncertain about why we were there, what we should be doing. And I think that there was a lot of frustration in that group that we had no goal. We spent a lot of time talking about process. You know, in addition to being white men, we also are lawyers, or most of us were lawyers, so we spent a lot of time talking about process and not really getting anywhere. I think it became apparent to all of us that was not an effective means for white people working at CLS to really operate within an affinity group, and so those two groups merged. The other thing that happened at the outset was that we were meeting, but we had no accountability or feedback to members of the collective, to our colleagues of color. And so when the collective sent their letter, which delineated over, I think, 16 to 20 pages of point-by-point issues that were ongoing at CLS, we in the affinity group received that letter and were sort of stymied. We didn't have a response that we felt like we could provide to that letter. And we spent a considerable period of time basically debating what our response should be. And we finally came out with simply an email that basically said, we got your letter, we hear what you have to say, and we look forward to working with you on these issues. And so I think what was important was that we didn't put together that initial accountability piece and that communication piece. And I think that caused some issues between the white affinity group and the collective, in that my sense is that there were a lot of questions from our colleagues of color because they weren't getting responses from their white colleagues. And I think that's something we could have done earlier, is really set up that channel of communication and that expectations of accountability. And I think that would have gone a long way to avoiding some of those misunderstandings that occurred. Subsequent to that, we have started to do that. So people like Michelle Majors, who was our equity director before Travis, and now Travis have really taken it on to try and maintain avenues of communication and let the expectation that the White Allies group will provide feedback and explanation about what we're working on to our colleagues of color. The other thing that I think Jen talked about a little bit was that for white folks, it's easy to stay in your headspace or to theorize about issues. And this has been an ongoing issue for our collective affinity group as well, is rather than talk about the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts, actual things that happen on the ground, take it to a theoretical level or talk about concepts. And I think sometimes we avoid talking about specifics for a number of reasons. One, it may seem impolite. Two, we may fear what our colleagues who are hearing us speak about these issues may think of us. Three, we may feel like we don't have the language to be able to appropriately articulate how we're feeling. Four, we may simply feel that we don't know enough to be able to speak. But one of the things that I think has been really valuable about the White Affinity Group is that we can no longer look to our colleagues of colors as experts on these issues. In conversations and meetings that we have had in the past, which have had staff of color and white staff together, as I imagine many of you experienced, oftentimes it's the staff of color that are seen and looked to by the white people as experts, or seen and looked to as the voice of what it means to be a racially inclusive organization. And one of the important things that's happened in our affinity group is that's not available anymore. And so white folks have had to step up to become experts and to become the spokespeople for why it's important that we value these principles, not only internally, but also in our work and as external. And CLS, and this is another example of our leadership has really made an issue, an important step, is that CLS as a whole has commitments that we try to abide by, not only in our affinity groups, but throughout our organization. And those really center the conversations we have in the affinity groups as well. The commitments that we as a whole and as individual advocates and staff have to one another. And that makes it easier to have difficult conversations. The other thing that I try and keep in mind when we're having difficult conversations or when we're exploring how we might be participating in this racialized world is to try and get outside the paradigm of intent. You know, too often white people get defensive because they feel like, well, you're saying I'm a racist, or you think badly of me, or I didn't mean to do that thing. My intent is relevant to this conversation. And if white people can just get outside that paradigm and outside of that box and simply say, look, we live in a racialized society. We are all indoctrinated with this. We will make mistakes. And let's give each other a break and get outside of intent and look at outcomes and focus on that. And if we as white people can do that in our affinity groups and elsewhere, basically get outside of this guilt and simply look at outcomes and not worry about intent, I think it makes it a lot easier for us to acknowledge our own mistakes, to acknowledge our role in this racialized world, and do it without sort of that guilt welling up. As my colleagues at CLS know, I have made many mistakes in this arena. And one of the things that I'm most grateful about is that my colleagues allowed me the space to understand my mistakes, live with my mistakes, learn from my mistakes, but not demonize me or make me feel as though I was a terrible person for things that I have done. And that's one of the things that I think we can all do, because even in the white affinity groups, at times we have become, and I have become, very judgmental of something that has happened. And it's easy to do because it makes you feel morally superior. It makes you can distance yourself from that other, but it's really important that we not do that. And give our colleagues the grace and the space to admit to mistakes and to really work on them. And that's one area where I think the White Affinity Group is trying to get to, is to more a place where we can do that and get to that place. One of the things that I think has really been well done is once we came together, the folks who were involved in the affinity groups that was really working well basically brought to us the concept that we need an agenda We need a curriculum. We need people to take responsibility for preparing. And we need a commitment from everybody that they are ready and willing to do the work. So an expectation is that we meet once a month. And the expectation is, unless you have a really damn good reason, you should be there. And that's easier said than done, but that's an expectation of the group. And I think that's one of the most important things, is that we agree that we are going to prioritize this as an important thing and be there for our colleagues. The other thing is, it's been helpful is to have actually a set curriculum. And we are working through a curriculum that a number of folks found and have been working with us on. And that's been helpful. But again, we continue to have growing pains. And I think the reality is that if you come out of these meetings feel like you've accomplished something and it's all good, then it really haven't actually grappled with what is really at stake. You're not going to feel good. You're not going to feel like you've accomplished a ton. Some meetings go well, some meetings go badly, but most importantly, it's that you just do it. What works at CLS is not going to work at every other organization. The dynamics may be different. The people, the personalities may be different, but it's really essential that I think that we all try. And I think if white people see staff of color having affinity groups, I feel it's incumbent on white people to then form their own affinity group to demonstrate that they are also grappling with these really important issues. I think that, one other point that I'd like to make is that it's also important to orient new people into the culture and into the affinity group. And this may be another thing that we haven't traditionally done as well as we could have. So we have, new staff joining us all the time, and really taking the time to bring them up to speed with the history, the culture, the purpose of the affinity group, and the expectations, I think is something that would be really valuable. And I think we're trying to do a better job of that, but that would be another thing that would be helpful to instill early, is that the expectation is that folks who've been doing it for a while don't just continue down the road. You have to be willing to go back, take 2 steps back, and bring people along who may be new to the effort, so that they understand where things have gone, understand where they are, where things are now, and feel more invested in the process going forward. So those are sort of some of my thoughts initially, and I'm happy to answer any questions that folks might have. Oh,
I wanted to. Go ahead, Nick.
So one other point, I saw that there were questions about how you do this across offices. Just a technical thing is that we used to meet in person so there would be a Seattle group that would meet in person, and we'd have representatives from various offices on the big screen in our conference room. And we realized that that's incredibly isolated, that the folks who were in the room were having conversations, but the folks online were really felt separate and isolated. And so what we've done is we've gone to the model where everybody is online. So everybody is in their own office on Skype, so that nobody has the monopoly on a group of people sitting in a room being able to interact in that way. Now, is that ideal? No. What would be ideal is if everybody was in the same room, but that's one thing we did to avoid this isolation or limitation based on location, is to actually have everybody online rather than some people together in a room and other people online. And so that was one of the resources that we've been utilizing. And I think it's relatively effective. The other thing it allows is for the group as a whole to meet, and then we can have breakouts of smaller groups to talk about the issue more in-depthly and with a little more intimacy, so the people who might not be inclined to speak up in a larger group have an opportunity to share their thoughts with a smaller group. Then that smaller group comes back to the larger group and reports in, and the conversation goes that way. So those are 2 sort of technical things that we've done that I think have really facilitated conversation and may allow statewide organizations to do this more effectively.
Thanks, Nick. There were a couple of points I kind of wanted to highlight in terms of some of the successes with the collective, and then some of the areas that we have historically struggled. So when we started the Affinity group, I was not here. I was unfortunately not with the organization yet, but I did come in at a time where there was a huge shift and transition in the way that the collective was organized. And so when oftentimes, and I've spoke to a number of folks who meet in Affinity spaces, including, corporate areas as well as other nonprofits. And one of the things that comes up is, folks tend to focus on the things that they find problematic, but often don't focus on the solutions for those. And so one thing I would say is finding a way to, I think that's great. I think this should be a space where people could communicate some of their issues. I think it should be a space for folks to, air out some of their grievances, but also we should be working on solutions. And so what we did was we created a way to take those situations that we identified as problematic and identified solutions to share with the organization. So that was one thing. The other thing is, how do we meet? What do we talk about? What are the things that really stand out? How do you choose topics? And what we have found is, as we continue with our race equity work, there is a huge area around internalized oppression that is often overlooked and ignored in race equity work. And internalized oppression is just kind of the internalized, thoughts and feelings and opinions that, people of color often hear in mostly white spaces, such as work or, most places that people frequent, that starts to get internalized. So, really starting to hone in on how do we overcome that internalized oppression? How do we acknowledge it, and how do we transition from that mindset? And so that's something that we've really focused on. We also have found that despite us being in the collective and everyone really, being open and honest in that space, you often get more intimate information and dialogue when you create even smaller groups. So while our collective is a little smaller now, at one point in time, we had a pretty large group. I think we were about 50% of the organization. And so we would have conversations around, what's the scariest thing you've ever experienced? How do you navigate, situations with the police, or how do you navigate someone who's being directly racist to you? And so we would have those conversations, but instead of having them in a large group, we would break down into smaller groups. So maybe even 3 to 4 people in a group, so that people could really dive into that conversation, but also really provide support for those individuals who have experienced those things. Also, one of the things that we have grappled with as well is how do we communicate things to the organization at large? So there have been moments in our organization where the collective has felt a particular way around topics. So for instance, if an email went out that we disagreed with or we thought should have been worded differently, who communicates that information? And so what the collective has kind of, created for ourselves is a liaison position. So there are individuals who will serve 1-year term, and basically they will be all things communication for the collective. So if we want to communicate with the White Allies group, if we want to communicate with external partners, external collective groups from other organizations, or if we want to just speak on behalf of the collective, these individuals would be the person who would communicate those things. One of our worst scenarios is, having a situation where, we have strong opinions, we have strong thoughts, but we don't respond, or there's radio silence because we're not collectivized, we're not organized in a way to kind of communicate some of those things. And so that's where that liaison position has come from. I think Nick pointed out a few really good points. So as the equity director here at Columbia Legal Services, I have a unique kind of viewpoint of both the collective and the White Allies. We're very respectful as an organization to allow the White Allies and the collective to operate independently, But there are moments where I, as the equity director, have an opportunity to kind of hear some of the thoughts and feelings of both groups. And one of the things that was identified was through conversation and dialogue with one of our white allies here in the organization. I asked them, like, what do you think the goal of the White Allies group is here? And they said to end racism. And I felt like that was such a heavy burden to have to carry as a white ally. I don't think that that's something that either the collective or the White Allies group really can accomplish in our small space. So my recommendation to them and my recommendation to you all is to take things one bite at a time. Focus on how can you de-bias and focus on race equity within yourself. And then once you're able to start making those type of accomplishments, then how can you start to do that in your interpersonal relationships within your office? And then taking it from there, and how can you have those same types of conversations within your community once you leave work? So I just wanted to put that out there. Our job, we cannot change racism all at one time. It takes us individually to really focus on it within ourselves, and then using our skills and the things that we learn from that process to begin to do that in our interpersonal and beyond. I know we're at time, so I will turn it back over to Omid and Jen.
Awesome. Thank you both, Travis and Nick. Yeah, I just want to do a time check. If folks got to hop off, go ahead and do so. I know we got a few questions near the end, so Travis or Nick, if I think you're seeing those, if you want to touch on those, you can. But I really like the end note that Travis spoke to, you know, and it goes back to those 5 levels of the race equity work. So, you know, doing that individual personal work, how it plays out interpersonally and so forth, all the way up to that societal, bigger change work. All of that work can allow us to be better in our power and our agency to really work in a collective shared vision to really undo racism and move race equity along. I think that piece is really important. If there are, yeah, so, okay, announcements. I just want to do a few announcements. One, we are working on a resource, kind of an addendum to our organizational race equity toolkit, focus on affinity groups. So look out for that in the coming months. Next few months, we're hoping to put that out. Our next REJI partner meeting is next Wednesday. All of this will get sent out in a follow-up email, including a feedback form for folks to share their feedback, solicit topics for new webinars. We'll have one in May, topic to be determined. And also for folks who are interested in being a part of affinity spaces that Just Lead will host, that will be open to all organizations. We'll have an opportunity for folks to share their interest in that and connect you with more information. And if you're not already on the mailing list, REJI, there will be an opportunity for you to connect on that as well, including announcement. We shared out work that's happening at the state level to create a statewide Office of Equity. There's some movement around that and ways for folks to sign on as a letter of support to make that happen. So all different ways folks can get further connected to REJI, get plugged in, and learn more about affinity spaces. Travis or Nick, are there any other comments, thoughts y'all want to leave us with? I know we had 2 questions, maybe one that we kind of touched on a little bit. I think Travis, you spoke to about how to bring back issues and concerns to the white ally group so that issues are resolved. Maybe that could be one you might touch on if you have any more to share there. And then a more general question about what type of support is provided to individuals who have experienced racism.
Yeah, I think, and I'll let Nick answer the specific white allies portion of the question, but I think one thing to really think about is that resolve looks completely different in these types of spaces. So asking, like, how do you resolve an issue? That could last a very long time. We really focus on restorative justice here and restorative practices. And so one of the things that is a part of that is understanding that resolve and closure they're 2 completely different things. And so I think looking for resolve in every situation may get complicated. I think the goal is to really start to figure out how do we close this situation. And that looks different for every individual person who's involved in each organization. To the last point, what type of support is provided for individuals who experience racism? So we create space and time in our organization, and this goes back to what Nick was saying, in creating space and creating a culture of race equity here. We allow time for those moments. So I personally experienced something here at CLS out on the street in Pioneer Square here in Seattle. And it was myself and another colleague of color, and we came in and we immediately got the support that we needed. One, because we had already established those relationships, and so folks understood and knew when they saw us that something was off. But for individuals and groups where that is not the case, I would recommend creating an opportunity and creating some sort of process or availability for folks to be able to weigh in with their caucusing groups. I think that's going to be really important and really essential because people of color often experience these things on a daily basis and sit with them, and most will not communicate those types of experiences. So creating the space to do so is going to be very important.
Awesome. Nick, do you have any thoughts on our last question, and then we can wrap up on what are the ways maybe CLS has brought back those issues that folks of color have come up with and shared them with the white ally group?
I think Travis talked about the letter, and that was a very effective way of bringing forward what should have been apparent to many of us, and I think wasn't quite as apparent as it should have been. I think part of that is also that the white folks have to be ready and able to hear the information and be ready and able to address it. And I think we were to some extent, but as I mentioned, that it took a while. What came out of that letter was that there were groups formed to really try and address many of the specifics. And again, I think that was organizationally something that was stressed and prioritized, that people were given the time and the space to really start working on specific issues. And so I think it's, again, I think it needs to be a cultural point, and it needs to be supported at all levels. And there may be organizations that don't have that now. And so maybe the expectation can't be as great as it might be other places, but at least folks really trying to put in the time and the effort to be intentional and thoughtful about these issues is, I think, the first step.
Got you. Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Travis. Appreciate both of y'all coming on and joining us today to really share what the Affinity Group work has looked like at Columbia Legal Services and what it's looked like in practice. It's a really value add to the conversation we're having today. And you know, we'll connect folks with those resources that we both promised and other folks asked in the chat. Jen,
please do not hesitate to reach out to us for any questions or resources, including to the extent that we can be helpful in connecting you with others who are in the same space that you are. That is what we're here to do. So please stay in communication with us, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you all. Appreciate everyone. And tell Jen happy birthday when you see him.
Happy birthday, Jen.
Bye-bye.